अगर आप एक इमिग्रेंट या फिर एक परमानेंट रेजिडेंट हों तो ये नेक्स्ट इंटरव्यू आपके लिए काफ़ी इन्फॉर्मेटिव होगी। बिल C-24 इस साल कैनेडियन लॉज में इंट्रोड्यूस हुआ और ये डुअल सिटीजनशिप को अफेक्ट कर सकता है। हमारे स्टूडियो में आए हुए मेहमान हैं John Singh, and let's talk to him a little bit more about what this bill is and how it affects your dual citizenship. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So you're articling with a law firm, which is Warren and Eder in
Yes.
Richmond, and they're a criminal defense law firm. So criminal defense and Bill C-24. Let's talk about this. So what exactly is Bill C-24?
For me to properly explain Bill C-24, I need to wind back to 2013. There was a set of laws introduced which better inform how C-24 came about this year. Previously, it's always been a matter of government policy that permanent residents who commit crimes can be deported.
Right.
But there was always a threshold for deportations. If you were sentenced to, if you receive a sentence of 2 years and above, it was an automatic deportation. But if your sentence was 2 years less a day, the government can apply to deport you, but you could argue your case before the Immigration Appeal Division.
Right.
And what they would do is they would hear both sides of the case, and they would decide whether it was fair to deport you. Now, that's usually for a situation such as a permanent resident who's been in the country for, let's say, 25 years. And he's made strong contributions to the community, and maybe he's gone through divorce and he's having an alcoholism period, and he slipped up, he committed a crime.
Mistakes happen.
Mistakes happen. Versus, you've had a permanent resident who's been in Canada for 3 months and he's committed a horrific crime. He may not have as much of a claim to remaining in Canada as, say, the previous example, but the Immigration Appeal Division was there to hear your appeal. Changes were introduced to the law in 2013. And what happened now? What happens now is that if your sentence is 6 months or higher versus 2 years less a day, you do not get a chance to appeal your deportation.
So just to clarify, 2 years plus a day would be, I guess 2 years minus a day. Anything above that is federal.
Right, because you're in federal time at 2 years, and that's a pronouncement from the court of how serious your crime is when you put in federal time versus 2 years less a day. So now, if your sentence is at least 6 months, it's an automatic deportation, and the minister doesn't really apply. He tells you you're deported, and you lose your permanent resident status, and you're returned back to the home country you're from. You have no chance to appeal, and it's a big change because a lot of crimes that were previously not caught under the 2 years less a day threshold, such as petty shoplifting, for example. It's routine for somebody to receive a 6-month jail sentence for something like shoplifting.
So speaking to those crimes, let's talk about those crimes. What exactly consists of, 2 years minus a day?
Right. It really depends on the individual circumstance. I mean, you have the more serious crimes such as murder or armed robbery, and that's usually going to get you more than
2 years.
2 years. But I mean, you have some certain crimes such as assault, depending on the severity of the assault. Depending on the circumstances of the assault and depending on your personal circumstances, your sentences can range anywhere from, an unconditional discharge to maybe even 5 years in jail, depending on the assault.
Okay.
So there's actually a wide range of circumstances. I mean, you have an individual with a long criminal record, and if he shoplifts or if she shoplifts, they could be getting 9-10 months in jail versus somebody who's doing it for the first time. They could be getting it for maybe 5 days in jail, maybe no jail time at all.
So that gives people a little bit of background on the type of crimes. So in terms of, let's bringing it back to the bill that is now law. So when it comes to, the general person, so let's use an example, So the example based on what we just talked about was, I'm just going to make something up here, is in the South Asian community, there's domestic violence. So if there is somebody that is an immigrant here, a permanent residency status, they happen to, have a couple of drinks extra, boom, something happens at home, there's an altercation, they get arrested, they get charged, they get convicted, it's possible for them to be deported based on that charge?
It is if their sentence is 6 months or more. It's an automatic deportation. the law has two provisions. One says anything over 6 months, and one says at least 6 months. So I'm going to err on the side of caution and say if it's 6 months, you're automatically deported if you're a permanent resident.
Wow. Okay, so that's going to get a lot of people to shape up right away. So, I mean, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? Because there's a lot of hoopla going on right now in the media that, this is, suddenly we're all second-class citizens if we're, permanent residents here. But yet, isn't it, I mean, based on this scenario that we just talked about, isn't it a good thing to get people to no longer be violent?
I think it depends on your perspective. I mean, on one camp, you have the individuals who say, look, living here is a privilege. You need to abide by the laws. You need to follow the laws. And if you don't, if you don't do it, you're out of here. But then there's the other camp who say, yes, but mistakes happen in life. And we're not saying you shouldn't be deported, but you should at least have a chance to plead your case before an appeal division as to why you shouldn't be deported. So it really depends on your perspective. But for me as a lawyer, what I find concerning is the removal of the chance to appeal. Because again, it doesn't matter if you've been here for a day or 55 years. If you get that 6-month sentence and you're a permanent resident, you are out.
You're out. So, okay, so speaking about this appeal portion, so what I've read is that instead of your case being heard by a federal judge, which is usually what it would be, is a judge, it's now heard by the minister.
That's the segue to that's Bill C-24 now. So C-24 is introduced. So I'll go back. The law I previously mentioned had targeted permanent residents only. And if you were a citizen, whether you're naturalized or you're born here, you always had this sense of comfort that your citizenship was ironclad. But Bill C-24 is now making changes to that. Previously, citizenship could be removed from somebody who had applied for citizenship, and if it was later found out that they misrepresented or put some falsehoods in their application, which is fair. You want to be truthful. Bill C-24 now introduces, it's not even a bill anymore, it's the law now.
It's a law.
Yeah, the law now introduces that if you are a citizen here, and if you have engaged in certain types of transgressions, engaging in armed conflict against Canada, terrorism offense that's punishable by at least 5 years, and there's a couple more, you can have your citizenship stripped and you can be deported. What's particularly illuminating about this bill is that it also applies to some people who are born here. Because if you're born here, you think that you have ironclad citizenship. But according to the bill, it leaves open the door that if one of your parents come from a country where because you're the descendant, you could get citizenship there, you can be deported back to that country, even though you've never been there or you have absolutely no connection to it.
You know what? We're going to go into more detail about this because that actually affects me in this situation. So on that note, we're just going to take a short break and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about this.
All right.
So at this point, हम एक छोटी सी break लेंगे.
ਘਰ ਇੱਕ ਐਸੀ ਥਾਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਹਰ ਕੋਈ ਆਪਣੀ ਨਿੱਜੀ ਜ਼ਿੰਦਗੀ ਦੇ ਸੁਨਹਿਰੀ ਪਲ ਯਾਦ ਰੱਖਦਾ ਹੈ। ਉਹ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਉਹ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਪਿਆਰ ਭਰਿਆ ਜੀਵਨ ਬਤੀਤ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਤਾਂ ਹੀ ਪੂਰੀਆਂ ਹੁੰਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਜਦ ਕਿਸੇ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਨੂੰ ਸਜੇ ਹੋਏ ਘਰ 'ਚ ਬਦਲਿਆ ਜਾਵੇ। ਨਵੇਂ ਘਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਫਰੇਮਿੰਗ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਫਿਨਿਸ਼ਿੰਗ ਤੱਕ, ਡ੍ਰੇਪਰੀ, ਪੇਂਟਿੰਗਸ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਡੈਕੋਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਅਸੈਸਰੀਜ਼ ਤੱਕ ਤੁਸੀਂ SK ਹੋਮ ਡਿਜ਼ਾਈਨਸ ਦੀਆਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਫੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਸਰਵਿਸਿਜ਼ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਸੁਪਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਘਰ ਨੂੰ ਹਕੀਕਤ 'ਚ ਬਦਲ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ। ਕੰਟੈਕਟ ਕਰੋ ਸੰਦੀਪ ਕੌਰ 6048259295.
Welcome back. So we were speaking with John Singh, who is an articling student with Warren and Eder, about Bill C-24 and how that's now become Canadian law. So John, what we were talking about before the break was about the bill and how it's now become law. So the previous changes, let's talk about that and how it made it easier to deport permanent residents.
I think one example your viewers will probably be able to relate to is Sukhwinder Singh Khosa.
Yes.
I don't know how many years ago this was. He was a street racer, and I believe during the street race somebody was killed, an innocent. I don't know if it was a driver.
Older Caucasian woman that was killed in this illegal street race.
And Sukhwinder Singh Khosa, I believe, a permanent resident, he'd been in Canada for I'm not sure what length of time. He was sentenced to 2 years less a day, I believe, if my facts aren't right. Now, under the previous law, Kosa had a right to appeal to the Immigration Appeal Division.
That's right.
And so the government would make their case to the division saying why he needed to be deported. Kosa would make his case. And as I mentioned earlier, the point of the division was that if Kosa had been somebody who was here for 30, 40 years, and maybe he had a couple of children that he's taking care of and big contributions to the community, it may have been more damaging to deport somebody like that with the effect it would have had on the kids in the community than to actually, then you just leave them. But with the new law, because Kosa's sentence is 6 months or over, he would be automatically deported today without a chance to make his hearing. Now, Kosa is one example, though, but I point to the other examples of permanent residents who've been here for a long time. You have the case of the permanent resident who moved here maybe when they were 5 days old, and perhaps they're 50 years old now.
Right. And so the law affects everybody the same.
Yes.
So just to clarify a little bit further, going back to this particular case, Sukhwinder Singh Kosa, so this was quite a few years ago now, so he committed this crime, he was found guilty, and so he was facing deportation. They appealed, and do you know where that was?
The ultimate decision was that he would be deported.
He would be deported.
It was a serious crime,
Okay.
and I feel that I read this in second year law school. His connection to the country wasn't strong enough to justify keeping him here.
Because he was a permanent resident.
Yes, and he wasn't here for a long time.
Okay. So now, under the new law, there's no chance for appeal at all.
There's no chance for appeal. The
it.
government has the hammer where they essentially tell you you're deported.
So then, isn't that the government keeping control over its citizens? I mean, is this human? Are we allowed to do this here?
It's right now it is, but court cases can change things. Battles in court, charter challenges can always change things. But as the way things stand right now, the government has put this into law.
So doesn't this go against? I mean, like when I read up about this law, and Amnesty International, it goes against the rules of the code, the code of conduct on humanity. So is this something that we can actually do? There's no rights for these people.
Well, it's really a modern manifestation of a very old, ancient, and some say primitive form of punishment, which is banishing someone, exiling them. We are signatories to international conventions that protect the rights of residents in such cases, but the courts have always deferred to the government to a greater degree when it comes to permanent residents, and for fair measure. I mean, it's protection of the borders, it's protection of the homeland. So it's a fine balance, but there hasn't been a challenge to this one yet in the courts.
Okay. So now let's talk about there was an example that you stated, or a case that you stated earlier before the break, was that somebody, let's say, like me, I was born here and my parents were not. So my parents were immigrants. And because my parents are from different countries, although now they are citizens, if they were to if I were to convict a crime, even though I was born here, I could be deported back to the country that they came from.
So the thing is, your parents have to come from a country where the country recognizes that they still have a citizenship, even though they have a Canadian citizenship, and you as their descendant, you can apply for citizenship there.
Okay. So if my parents, for example, have a dual citizenship, that's what you're saying?
Or even if your parents moved and say they received citizenship, as long as the country they come from recognizes that you as their descendant can apply for citizenship there. And some countries do have those laws.
Right.
The bill currently doesn't apply to general crimes per se. It applies to acts of treason, spying, terrorism offenses, armed conflict against Canada. What's of note in the bill is that it says terrorism offenses punishable by at least 5 years. So in some circles, the ground has been set that if you're convicted of a crime punishable for 5 years, that may be grounds to take away your citizenship.
Deportation.
Right.
Okay, so, I mean, the concern, obviously, there's two concerns here that come out of this. Number one is that as a Canadian citizen, I could be deported, but I was born here. This is my only country. So doesn't this go against like the UN Charter?
It does. There's a provision in the law that says the law doesn't apply if it leaves you stateless. Now that applies in a situation where I'm assuming your home country is, let's say, South Africa.
Sure.
And if South Africa doesn't have a law that permits you to have citizenship because you're a descendant, the government, according to law, they cannot take your citizenship away because that would leave you stateless at this point. But there's also a bigger challenge in mind because Section 6 of the Charter states that citizens have the right to travel anywhere in and out of Canada. And it's been interpreted that that means they cannot exile you. So one problem with this law among legal circles is that it's now creating, as they say, two classes of citizenship. There's right now, the safest citizen is the one who is born in Canada and whose parents cannot apply for citizenship in any country, nor would that person be able to apply for citizenship in another country based on being a descendant of those parents. But then you go down the line, though, you wouldn't be in as safe a position because your parents could apply for citizenship in the other country, and so could you.
Okay.
So there's some discussion in legal circles that this is a clear violation of the Charter. But it's a new law and it hasn't been tested in the courts yet, though a challenge is coming up from what I've heard.
Okay. So now on the flip side of that, really quickly, is that just don't commit a crime against the state.
Right, against the state now, but I hate to bring up slippery slope though, but it's against the state now, but 10 years down the road, it could be don't commit a crime.
Oh, I see.
20 years down the road, it could be don't commit a crime that's punishable by at least a month in jail. So
that power lies within the government to change as they see fit.
Right. It's or the courts, if they interpret it and say this is not fair, it violates the Charter, you need to redo it.
Got it. Wow. There's so much more we can talk about with this issue, but why don't we come back on another time and discuss a little bit more about this in depth. But I really appreciate you coming out and at least starting the conversation amongst these circles with permanent residents and lending a bit of reality. Not instead of the pandemonium that's going on out there, let's really talk about the facts and get down to it as to how does this relate to me. So thank you for that, John.
Thank you for having me.